If you ask Joel Osteen how he got so filthy, stinking rich, he'll tell you it was the power of prayer. According to him and other famous televangelists like Kenneth Copeland and Creflo Dollar, it's your faith in and obedience to God that will beef up your bank account and give you all the worldly pleasures your heart desires. It's the message of the prosperity gospel. The idea that God will bestow material wealth upon those who sow their seeds in the church. But does Joel Osteen honestly believe what he preaches every Sunday? Or is it just a ploy to keep the money flowing in? Joel's father, John Osteen, founded Lakewood Church back in 1959. The first Lakewood service took place on Mother's Day of that year. A tiny Houston congregation gathered in an abandoned livestock feed store. Sounds like humble beginnings for a church that has now grown to house thousands of attendees every week. John and his second wife Dolores oversaw a period of gradual growth during their time at the helm of Lakewood. By 1979, the church community had increased to more than 5,000 members, and they were becoming a well-known staple of the Pentecostal and charismatic denominations. It was during this time that Lakewood began televising its sermons. As television became accessible to the masses, the Osteens hopped on board and made the absolute most of it. They recognized a potential opening in the market for televised church services and jumped at the chance to put Lakewood at the forefront of the new movement. It was a home run move for the folks at Lakewood, and the televangelism efforts of their ministry have helped the church grow to previously unimaginable heights. Upon his father's death in January of 1999, Joel, the youngest son in the family, officially took on the responsibilities as the lead pastor at Lakewood Church, and he never looked back. Under the guidance and leadership of Ostee, Lakewood Church has experienced unprecedented growth in the past 22 years. While his father established a solid community of believers that called Lakewood home, Joel has taken that community and multiplied it tenfold. The church was quickly becoming far too big to continue using their old location, and in 2003, they officially found a new home to accommodate their growing congregation. Just 4 years after Joel became Lakewood's senior pastor, the church signed a 30-year lease for the Compaq Center, the former home of the Houston Rockets. From the moment Ostee put pen to paper, former Compaq Center became Lakewood Church's central campus, and it continues to function as Osteen's primary facility. The multi-purpose sports arena has a capacity of 16,800, so it's a little roomier than the abandoned feed store. Osteen made massive renovations to the building after Lakewood took over in 2003. They continued to tinker with the building's makeup for a few years before it officially opened up on Sunday mornings in the summer of 2005. In the period since Lakewood first moved into their new location, more than $100 million worth of extensive renovations has been put into the enormous facility to ensure it meets the very high standard that Osteen envisions for his church. As it stands today, the building is as sprawling and lavish as any church you're likely to find. It was also the venue for several high-profile concerts over the years before Lakewood acquired it in 2003. Before Osteen, the arena welcomed world-renowned English rock band The Who into town back in 1975, and the music acts that followed didn't get any less famous. Legendary rock groups like Queen, Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, and Kiss all performed at the venue during the 1970s and 80s. Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Michael Jackson, and NWA took the stage before 2003. Before Osteen transformed it into a house of worship, the last concert in that building was a ZZ Top show. Fittingly, the band was on their Beer Drinkers and Hellraisers tour across the country. You slice it, Sunday mornings with Joel Osteen feel more like a rock concert than a church service. Osteen has become an overwhelmingly popular figure in the world of televangelism, even making regular appearances at sold-out arenas like Yankee Stadium. What is it about Osteen that makes him irresistible to so many people? It has to be more than his winning, full-teeth smile, right? Like many televangelists, Osteen preaches prosperity gospel. As we mentioned earlier, the prosperity gospel is a theological belief under the umbrella of what's known as charismatic Christianity. In a nutshell, pastors like Osteen and Copeland claim that God will reward those who donate to the church with wealth, health, and miracles. Donate to the church and get rich is the message people like Osteen preach to their followers. It's what guys like Osteen, Kenneth Copeland, Creflo Dollar say to justify their outrageous spending habits and luxurious lifestyles. To them, Their incredible wealth is a sign that their faith is especially strong. Unfortunately, Osteen's rock star life fuels much of the disdain around him. Osteen haters argue that it's easy for him to talk about the financial benefits of living a godly life when he doesn't know the first thing about money trouble. He is, by all intents and purposes, part of the 1% of American society. Why should people listen to Osteen about persevering through hardships when the toughest thing he has to do is decide whether he wants lobster or steak for dinner? When we say millionaire preacher, we mean multi-millionaire preacher. Through the global operation of his ministry, his speaking tours, and his best-selling Christian self-help books, Osteen has accumulated an enormous amount of personal wealth as senior pastor at Lakewood Church. It's estimated that his net worth is between $40 and $65 million, although there are other reports that it's more like $100 million. It's those book sales that account for the majority of Osteen's wealth. His first book, titled Your Best Life Now, reached the top of the New York bestsellers list in 2004. In it, Osteen details 7 specific steps people should take in their everyday lives to maximize their potential. It has continued to fly off bookshelves since it came out and was accompanied by Osteen's 2007 book, Better You. The sequel offered 7 more tips to improve readers' lives and shot to the top of the New York Times charts once again. Sounds like he could have just written one more book with all 14 tips, but hey, what do we know? But his income doesn't stop at just book sales. While he's entitled to a $200,000 a year salary as the senior pastor at Lakewood Church, he claims he's never accepted payment for his services since he took over for his dad back in 1999. It's a seemingly generous gesture that, in reality, doesn't make 1 ounce of difference for Osteen and his family. It's just a drop in the bucket compared to the cash he earns during his cross-country speaking tours. Remember how he said he regularly sells out Yankee Stadium? Osteen travels all across the U.S., speaking to giant crowds and earning himself fat paychecks while he's at it. After preaching to packed arenas, Osteen goes home to a gorgeous $10.5 million Houston mansion. The 17,000 square foot property is big enough for him, his wife Veronica, and their 3 children to each have their own bathrooms with 1 left over. With 6 bedrooms, 5 fireplaces, a guest house, and a functioning 3 elevator system, it's safe to say the Osteens have experienced plenty of prosperity. If the epic house wasn't enough, Osteen also owns a yacht and his very own private jet, a pricey Airbus A319 to be exact. That's one of the most expensive models available to the public and commonly used by airlines around the globe. The price tag? About $90 million, give or take. There are plenty of rich people around the world, but they're just slightly disliked by most ordinary people. What sets Osteen apart? Most of it stems from the fact that he presents himself as a man of God, but his behavior doesn't reflect that of a humble preacher. Just take a look at Osteen's response during the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. Back in 2017, Harvey wreaked havoc on Houston and the surrounding area. Homes were lost, lives were upended, and many Texans found themselves with nowhere else to turn. If only there were a massive church building right smack dab in the middle of Houston that could house desperate residents displaced by the hurricane. Lakewood Church campus was the perfect place to give those in need. Better yet, they're Christians over there. Surely they'd be interested in helping those less fortunate. Believe it or not, Lakewood did not open its doors to people suffering due to Hurricane Harvey, and they got a lot of heat because of it. Osteen was specifically targeted by people online who were disgusted with his decision not to allow helpless Houston residents to stay in the literal arena that he and his church owns. It's not like there was complicated contract jargon in the lease agreement keeping them from opening the doors to the public. Lakewood had bought the facility outright from the city of Houston back in 2010. It was theirs to do with what they pleased. Helping those in need was not one of those things. Lakewood PR tried to backpedal as quickly as possible, claiming that hurricane waters had flooded their building. They neglected to back this claim up with any actual evidence, however, and things looked even worse when Joel Osteen himself came out and addressed the criticism. He took back what the church initially said about their building being flooded, stating that instead, Lakewood was never closed to the public and that any reports to the contrary were verifiably false. So it's clear that Lakewood and company were probably trying to muddy the waters and distract people from the controversy at hand. It's unclear what exactly happened and why Lakewood was not at the forefront of the Harvey relief efforts. Nevertheless, it was an undeniable black mark on Osteen's record, and his critics use it as proof that the popular televangelist does not practice what he preaches. There was even a satirical cartoon and article published about Osteen and his response to the floods. The Onion-like article detailed how Joel set sail into the flooded streets of Houston aboard his multi-million-dollar yacht. Lakewood is that they're so popular and donations that they ultimately function similarly to an actual company rather than a church. Still, by the letter of the law, they don't have to pay up like normal businesses. Last Week Tonight touched on tax exemptions for churches in a brilliant segment where comedian John Oliver dedicated an entire piece to exposing people like Osteen, Copeland, and Dollar. Oliver started his own fake church called Our Lady of Perpetual Exemption, a subtle wink and nod at the focus of his experiment, the tax exemptions enjoyed by megachurches like Lakewood. Osteen does come off as more likable than some other TV pastors. Why? His willingness to appear frequently on TV for interviews gives us a little more transparency into his life. Old-timers like Copeland make their money and do their best to fade into the background. Osteen, on the other hand, is a lot more visible. He's been interviewed by the likes of Oprah Winfrey and Larry King, and even has a high-profile friendship with Kanye West, who's appeared at multiple Lakewood services. Osteen's appearance on Oprah garnered mixed reviews. Whenever he's being interviewed, Osteen makes a point to present as sterilized and inoffensive a message as he possibly can. As a result, it's easy to read his tone as being insincere, which ultimately calls into question just how genuine he is about anything he teaches on Sundays. Osteen and his megachurch have continued to grow in recent years. Fox Business recently cited Lakewood as the largest church in America. They have over 50,000 members as of today, most of whom can only tune in to Sunday service online or on TV. Osteen made headlines during the COVID crisis with his star-studded virtual Easter service, which featured Mariah Carey, Tyler Perry, and his old pal Kanye. Lakewood was among those that chose to move entirely online, and Osteen tried to make the most of it with his celebrity-filled Easter celebration. However, in July of 2020, Lakewood was loaned $4.4 million by the federal government to account for the loss in donation revenue they experienced during the pandemic. Even though Lakewood is exempt from paying taxes, they were still awarded a PPP loan to cover their employees' wages. Lakewood officials insisted that Osteen did not personally benefit from the loan in any way, and that all of the funds they received were given directly to their 368 church employees. Nonetheless, people were skeptical of whether the church needed the massive loan, the third largest PPP loan in the Houston area. It seems that no matter what happens, Osteen is going to have his fair share of supporters and critics, and he'll be smiling through it all. If you lived the kind of life he's got, wouldn't you?